Somewhere beneath the worn and sun-bleached surface of the Great Pyramid, there is a ceiling made of granite that was cut and transported from a quarry 500 miles to the south without the use of iron tools, wheeled carts, or any draft animal large enough to pull it. At its peak, the Great Pyramid of Giza stood 481 feet tall, and for more than 3,800 years, nothing built by human hands rose higher anywhere on Earth. That is not a detail that softens with repetition. 3,800 years is longer than the entire span of recorded Western history, longer than the gap between ancient Rome and the present day, longer than almost any other measure a person might reach for. The pyramid simply stood there, at the edge of the desert plateau west of the Nile, while civilizations rose and fell and rose again beneath it, and it remained the tallest thing any person had ever made until a cathedral spire in Lincoln, England, finally edged past it sometime in the 14th century. And even that record is debated, the spire having since collapsed, and the question left quietly open. The plateau it sits on is called Giza, and the pyramid is the northernmost and largest of three that stand there together. From a distance, across the flat desert, the three pyramids appear to float slightly above the horizon line, the way large things sometimes do in dry air and heat shimmer. The Great Pyramid is the one that draws the eye first, not only because of its size, but because of something in its proportions. The angle of its sides is just steep enough to feel deliberate and considered, just shallow enough to feel stable, permanent, like something that has always been there and intends to remain. Up close, that sense of permanence becomes something more physical. The base of the pyramid covers more than 13 acres of ground. A person standing at the base and looking up sees not a smooth surface rising to a distant point, but a staircase of enormous stone steps, each course of blocks a little higher than seems comfortable, each one worn and weathered at its edges, but still fundamentally intact. The lowest courses alone are taller than a grown person. There is a tendency, standing there, to stop thinking in the usual way, because the usual measures stop working. The scale is simply too far outside ordinary experience for the mind to process easily, and so the mind quiets, and the stone simply becomes present in a way that most things are not. The pyramid is oriented with extraordinary precision to the cardinal directions. Its four sides face north, south, east, and west, and the alignment is so close to perfect that the small remaining error, less than 1/10 of a degree, has itself become a subject of study. Researchers trying to understand how builders 4,500 years ago achieved something that would challenge a modern surveyor working with instruments. The base, too, is almost perfectly level, varying by less than an inch across its entire enormous span, which is remarkable on its own terms, but becomes more remarkable when considered alongside everything else. That this precision was achieved on open desert without the tools most people assume precision requires. The desert light does particular things to the stone. In the early morning, when the sun is low and coming from the eastern face of the pyramid catches the light fully, and the western face falls into deep shadow, and the structure appears almost to have two natures at once, one warm and one cool, one illuminated and one withheld. In the middle of the day, the light flattens everything, and the pyramid seems somehow less dramatic, more simply geological, a natural feature of the landscape rather than a made thing. In the late afternoon, the shadows lengthen and deepen again, and the pyramid recovers its weight and presence. These shifts happen slowly, the way all large things in the desert change, without urgency, without drama. The pyramid was built during the reign of the pharaoh Khufu, in the period known as the Old Kingdom of Ancient Egypt, roughly 4.5 millennia ago. It was built as a tomb, though whether it ever contained what it was built to contain is a question that has no clean answer. The chamber inside is empty, has been empty as long as any historical record reaches, and what the pyramid held or was meant to hold has passed beyond recovery into the long silence that eventually takes most things. What has not passed into silence is the structure itself. It is still there, still nearly as tall as it was when it was finished, still sitting on the same plateau above the same river valley, still casting the same slow-moving shadow across the desert floor as the sun moves overhead. The weight of it, the sheer material fact of it, is something that does not diminish over time and does not simplify. It simply accumulates, the way that certain kinds of quiet do, settling deeper the longer it goes on. The pyramid is, first and most basically, a pile of stone. And that fact, stated plainly, does nothing to reduce it, because the stone itself is worth dwelling on before anything else. Most of what makes up the pyramid's body came from nearby, from a limestone plateau just to the south and west of the construction site itself. Limestone is a sedimentary rock, meaning it was laid down in ancient ocean beds over millions of years as the compressed remains of marine creatures settled and solidified. And the limestone of the Giza Plateau is dense and workable, the kind of stone that holds its shape when cut with copper tools and wooden wedges, and the patient application of water and weight. Quarry workers followed the natural grain of the rock, cutting channels, driving wedges, breaking away blocks that were then dragged on sledges to the base of the rising structure. The blocks vary in size. Some weigh 2 or 3 tons, others considerably more, but the average is somewhere around 2.5 tons, and there are more than 2 million of them stacked in the pyramid's core. That number is not the kind that lands easily. It tends to pass through the mind like all very large numbers do, recognized as significant without being fully felt. But the blocks are real, and they are still there, and they do not settle or shift the way softer materials would. They simply sit, as they have sat for 4,500 years, holding the shape that was planned for them. The core limestone was never meant to be seen. It was always interior material, structural, load-bearing, the inner body of the thing rather than its face. What the world was meant to see was something else entirely. A smooth, white, continuous skin of much finer stone that covered the entire outer surface from the base to the apex, turning the stepped and rough-cut core into something more like a single polished form catching light. This outer layer came from a place called Tura, across the Nile to the east, where the limestone is finer grained and far lighter in color, almost white when freshly cut and dressed. The Tura quarries sit in the cliffs of the eastern bank, and the stone they yielded had a quality the local plateau limestone lacked: a smoothness, a brightness, a surface that could be finished to a near-flat plane and fitted tightly against the neighboring block with very little gap between them. Casing stones from Tura have been found at other sites with joints so fine that a blade cannot easily be slid between them, which suggests a degree of precision in cutting and fitting that was clearly deliberate and carefully maintained across the entire exterior surface. When the pyramid was new and its casing was intact, it would have looked nothing like what stands on the Giza Plateau today. It would have been white, or close to white, depending on the light and the hour, brilliant in full sun, warm and golden in the lower angles of morning and evening, and almost luminous against the blue of the sky in the clear, dry air of the desert. The surface would have been largely unbroken, the individual casing blocks fitted so well that from a distance the whole structure would have read as a single smooth-sided form rather than a stepped or layered one. There is something worth sitting with in that image, the pyramid as it was, complete and sealed in pale stone, before time and circumstance began to take it apart. The casing did not disappear slowly through weathering alone. Limestone is durable but not impervious, and the desert climate is relatively kind to stone, which is part of why the core has survived so well. What took the casing away was human use. Over many centuries, beginning particularly in the medieval period, the fine white Tura stone was quarried from the pyramid itself and carried across the river to Cairo, where it was used as building material for mosques, palaces, and city walls. The casing was valuable precisely because it was already cut and dressed to a high finish, which made it useful and portable in a way that the core blocks, deeper and heavier and less accessible, were not. And so the pyramid was unmade at its surface, layer by layer and stone by stone, until what remained was the stair-stepped, rougher textured core that visitors have walked around and climbed on and photographed ever since. A small number of original casing stones remain at the base on the north side, still sitting in place, still showing something of the angle and finish they were given when the pyramid was whole. They are not dramatic to look at, pale grey rather than white now, worn and partially buried. But they are the closest thing to a surviving sample of the original surface, a remnant of the skin that once covered everything. Standing near them and looking up at what the pyramid is now, and then trying to hold in mind what it was, requires a kind of imaginative effort that is not quite visualization and not quite grief, but something in the space between the two. What remains is still massive, still astonishing in its proportions, still capable of producing that particular silence in people who stand close to it. But it is a different object than the one that was finished on the plateau above the Nile. The original is gone, in the way that many finished things eventually go, not destroyed all at once, but gradually, piece by piece, repurposed into other structures that have themselves often since crumbled or been built over or forgotten. The material persists somewhere in the walls of the city perhaps, mixed into foundations or worn smooth under centuries of hands and feet. The pyramid that sent that stone out into the world now stands without it, its rougher interior facing outward, holding the shape of something that was once enclosed and bright and sealed against the sky. What lies beneath the surface, inside the mass of the pyramid, is a different world from the outer slopes of stacked limestone. The interior is granite country, a harder, darker stone entirely, one that required a different kind of effort to obtain and a different kind of patience to move. The granite did not come from Giza. It did not come from anywhere near the plateau or from the quarries in the hills to the east of the Nile. It came from Aswan, which is a city far to the south, at the first of the great cataracts where the river narrows and the water moves fast between outcroppings of pink and grey stone. The distance between Aswan and Giza is somewhere in the range of 800 kilometers by river, a journey that, even in the modern world, takes real time and effort, and that in the age of the pyramid's construction would have meant weeks of coordinated movement along the current, on vessels built specifically for the weight of the stone they carried. The granite blocks that made that journey are not small. Some of the ceiling beams in the interior chambers weigh in the range of 70 or 80 tons, masses that are difficult to hold in the mind in any useful way, though one way to approach them is to imagine a fully loaded freight truck and then another beside it, and to understand that the combined weight of both is still less than what a single one of those beams carries. That is the scale of what was placed, deliberately and with great precision, into the upper reaches of the pyramid's core. The chamber that draws the most attention is the one called the King's Chamber, though the name is a convention of later visitors rather than a designation from the builders themselves. It sits near the center of the pyramid's mass, accessed by a long ascending corridor and then by a wider passageway called the Grand Gallery, which is itself a remarkable construction, a corbelled tunnel where each successive course of stone steps slightly inward over the one below it, creating a high, tapering passage that runs upward at a steady incline. The corbelled form, where stones lean progressively inward from both sides to form a narrowing overhead, was a technique the builders used to distribute weight rather than let it accumulate directly above the open space. It is a solution to a specific structural problem, arrived at in stone, and it works. The King's Chamber at the end of that ascent is a long rectangular room lined entirely in granite. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it is the same dark Aswan stone, cut flat and fitted together with the kind of closeness that leaves almost no perceptible gap. The room is not large by any standard that would register as impressive in a modern building. It is perhaps 10 meters long and 5 meters wide, and perhaps 5.5 meters high. A room that a small number of people could stand in comfortably, and that would feel entirely unremarkable were it not for what is above it. The ceiling of the chamber is formed by 9 enormous granite beams laid side by side, spanning the full width of the room. Their combined weight is enormous, and the builders understood that simply resting that much stone directly atop the chamber would eventually exert enough force to crack the walls or the floor. So they built, above the ceiling, a series of additional chambers, not rooms anyone was ever meant to enter or occupy, but narrow spaces separated by further layers of massive stone, each one designed to progressively distribute and redirect the load of the pyramid's mass, pressing down from above. There are 5 of these relieving spaces stacked above the king's chamber, one on top of another, with the topmost one finished not with flat granite, but with a pointed roof of limestone blocks angled to send the downward force outward to either side rather than straight down. The result is that the chamber below remains intact, as it has for something in the range of 4,500 years. The granite ceiling has not cracked, the walls have not shifted, the floor is level. Something that was built to last has, in fact, lasted, and the precision of that outcome is not accidental. Standing in that room, and many people have over the centuries, there is a quality to the air and the silence that visitors consistently describe in terms that reach for something beyond the merely architectural. The mass of stone above is immense, and the knowledge of it changes the experience of the space. There is a kind of stillness that comes from being inside something that has been very deliberately sealed and protected and weighted down from above, a stillness that the limestone slopes outside do not quite reproduce. The air is cool. The granite walls absorb sound differently than softer stone would. The room does not echo so much as it simply swallows whatever sound enters it. What the chamber contains now is an empty granite box, a sarcophagus, rectangular and lidless, that was too wide to have been brought in through any of the corridors leading to the room. It must have been placed there before the chamber was sealed above it, incorporated into the structure as the pyramid grew. Whatever it once contained is long gone, if it ever contained anything at all. There is a kind of repose in considering the sarcophagus that way, built in, permanent from the moment of placement, as much a part of the room as the walls themselves. The chamber was not fitted around an object that was brought later. The chamber was built from the beginning with that object at its center, and everything above it. The relieving spaces, the millions of limestone blocks pressing down toward the plateau, was placed afterward, in sequence, leaving the granite room and its contents exactly where they were meant to be. The men who cut the granite at Aswan worked with tools of harder stone, dolerite, a particularly tough rock used as a pounding implement, and with copper chisels, and with whatever accumulated knowledge their craft had developed over the generations that preceded the pyramid's construction. Iron was not yet in use. The quarrying of granite without it is a slower process, one that relies on patience and repetition and a very clear understanding of where the stone wants to split. The builders of Aswan knew their stone that way, and the evidence of their work, channels cut by hand into the rock, some abandoned mid-process, remains visible there today, a record of the method preserved in the quarry itself. From the quarry to the Nile, and then north along the current to Giza, and then inland to the plateau and upward into the rising structure of the pyramid, each step of that journey required organization and coordination across distances that were real and significant, even by the measure of later, more technologically equipped civilizations. The granite arrived. It was placed where it needed to be. The ceiling has not moved. And yet the question of how stone moved at all, not just granite, but the steady accumulation of limestone block after limestone block, remained genuinely open for a long time. The kind of problem that seemed almost too large to approach from the fragmentary evidence that archaeology tends to offer. The answer, or at least a substantial part of it, came not from the pyramid itself, but from a place called Hatnub. a site in the Egyptian desert to the south and east, where alabaster had been quarried since the earliest dynasties. Excavations there, conducted over years of careful work and reported in detail in 2018, uncovered something that changed the conversation considerably. Inside the quarry, carved into the rock, was a ramp, and the ramp itself was not unusual, ramps being a common feature of ancient quarrying wherever heavy material needed to be hauled uphill or down. What made this particular ramp significant was its configuration and what accompanied it. The ramp was steep by the standards of what had been theorized for the pyramid, far steeper than a wheeled vehicle or even an animal team could have managed efficiently, and it was flanked on both sides by a pair of stone staircases, each lined with rows of post holes cut into the rock. The posts that once stood in those holes had clearly served as anchors for ropes. The picture that emerged was of a sledge being hauled directly up the steep central slope, with workers positioned on the staircases pulling ropes looped around those fixed anchors, using them for leverage much the way a modern climber uses a fixed line, turning an incline that would otherwise have been unmanageable into one a coordinated team could climb. The rope and post system solved one problem: how to climb a steep slope. But it does not by itself explain how blocks moved efficiently across the long, level stretches of ground between the quarries and the pyramid. For that, the key piece of evidence comes from somewhere else entirely: a painted scene in a tomb at Deir el-Bersha, a couple of centuries after Khufu's reign, showing workers hauling a colossal seated statue on a sledge across open ground. At the front of the scene, a man stands pouring water from a jar directly onto the sand ahead of the runners. Egyptologists had known the image for a long time without being entirely certain what it depicted. Taken together with basic materials science, the scene reads plainly enough. Dry sand behaves the way anyone who has tried to drag something heavy across a beach knows it does. It compresses and pushes back unevenly, and the leading edge of a sledge tends to plow into it, creating a bow wave of resistance that only grows as weight increases. Wet sand does something different. The water fills the small gaps between the grains and creates a kind of surface tension between them, locking them briefly together so that the sand behaves more like a solid than a loose aggregate. A sledge moving over wet sand meets something closer to a smooth surface, and the force required to keep it moving drops dramatically, by half or more depending on how much water is applied and how consistently. This is not a small difference. At the scale of a 2.5-ton limestone block on a wooden sledge, that reduction in resistance is the difference between a task requiring extraordinary effort and one that organized teams of workers could accomplish steadily across long distances, day after day. The Nile offered water in abundance, and the route from the riverbank to the plateau passed over ground that could be prepared in advance, dampened in sections as the sledge moved forward, workers cycling ahead to wet the next stretch while the sledge crossed the last. It was a process that required coordination and supply, not magic, and that is precisely what makes it satisfying in the way that good explanations tend to be. It reduces the mystery, not by diminishing the achievement, but by revealing the intelligence embedded in it, the accumulated understanding of material and physics that a culture develops over generations of working with stone and sand and rope. The limestone core blocks, which make up the great bulk of the pyramid's mass, were quarried close by, just south of the construction site, and the distance they needed to travel was relatively short. Even so, moving 2 million of them, each weighing somewhere between 2 and 15 tons depending on where in the structure they were placed, demanded a system that could operate continuously across the decades of construction. The wet sand method, scaled up to the size of the workforce and the duration of the project, offers a picture of how a system like that might have functioned, not through any single dramatic innovation, but through the disciplined application of a method that worked reliably when it was consistently executed. The larger blocks required more workers on the ropes, more water applied more carefully, more attention to the condition of the path. The granite from Aswan, which had already made its long journey by river, would have needed the full force of every technique available once it reached the plateau. But even the smaller limestone blocks, moved in their hundreds of thousands, tell the same story, that the builders had a working understanding of how to reduce the effort of moving heavy things across ground, and that they applied that understanding systematically. There is something in this that becomes visible only at a distance, looking back across the centuries at what these fragments of evidence preserve almost by accident. Post holes cut into rock at Hatnub, set in careful rows, and a painted scene on a tomb wall at Deir el-Bersha, each recording a different piece of the same underlying problem. The builders did not leave explanations. They left the work itself, and occasionally, in places like Hatnub, or in images like the one at Deir el-Bersha, they left the tools of the doing, or a picture of it, traces of methods so practiced that no one thought to write them down, because everyone at the time already knew. Neither discovery solves everything on its own. Together, they answer the question of hauling in a way that satisfies the evidence and fits the physical reality. And they leave the question of raising, of getting blocks not just across the ground, but up into the growing height of the pyramid itself, still open, still waiting for the next piece. That question of rising, of how stone was carried not horizontally across sand, but upward, against gravity, onto a structure that grew taller by increments over the course of 2 decades, is the one that has occupied researchers most persistently, and the one for which the physical evidence is most difficult to read. The simplest answer, and the one proposed earliest, is also the most visually intuitive. A ramp, built from the ground, sloping gently upward from the base of the pyramid to whatever level the work had reached, allowing sledges to be pulled up the incline by teams of workers using ropes and the same wet sand technique that made hauling so effective on flat ground. The ramp would have grown as the pyramid grew, extended outward and upward in stages, made of the same compacted rubble and mud brick that the builders used for temporary structures elsewhere. There is even surviving evidence of such ramps at other construction sites from the same period, their angles and compositions preserved in the desert well enough to give researchers a clear sense of how they were built and used. The difficulty is a matter of geometry. A straight ramp long enough to reach the upper levels of the Great Pyramid at a workable angle, shallow enough that sledges could actually be pulled up it, would have had to extend for a very considerable distance out into the desert, perhaps further than the space available on the plateau, and would itself have required an enormous volume of material to construct, material that would then have needed to be removed when the pyramid was finished. The ramp, in other words, may have been nearly as large an undertaking as parts of the pyramid itself. This does not make the straight ramp impossible, but it makes it unwieldy as a complete explanation, particularly for the upper portions of the structure where the slope required to stay manageable becomes almost absurd in its projected length. A second possibility sidesteps this by trading length for complexity. Rather than a single straight incline reaching out across the plateau, a switchback ramp would have wrapped around the pyramid itself, climbing in stages along the outer faces, doubling back at each corner, gaining height gradually without requiring the same enormous reach into the surrounding landscape. Workers and sledges would have moved in shorter runs, turning at each corner, working their way upward in a pattern that mirrors the kind of switchback roads cut into mountainsides in much later centuries. The material of the ramp in this case would have rested against the pyramid's own outer surface, which raises its own complications. Covering the casing stones as they were laid would have made inspection and finishing more difficult, but the geometry is far more plausible for the upper reaches of the structure. Neither the straight ramp nor the switchback ramp has left behind the kind of unambiguous physical remains that would settle the question. No single theory is fully proven, and the precise combination of methods that actually carried stone to its final position in the pyramid remains genuinely open. What is clear is that ramps of some form were part of the answer. The evidence for ramp construction in ancient Egypt is too widespread and too consistent to dismiss, but the exact configuration, and whether it changed as the pyramid grew taller, is still being worked out. The most provocative possibility arrived in the form of research published in the early part of this century, when a French architect named Jean-Pierre Houdin proposed that the pyramid itself might contain the answer inside its own body. His hypothesis suggested that the lower levels of the pyramid were raised using an external ramp that covered roughly the first third of the structure's height, and that above that point, the builders switched to a ramp that spiraled upward through the interior of the pyramid. A continuous ascending passage built inside the stone as the outer structure rose around it, with open notches at the corners to allow the sledges to turn. When the construction was finished, this internal ramp would have been sealed off, incorporated into the pyramid's mass, invisible from the outside and from most approaches inside. The idea is elegant in the way that good hypotheses tend to be. It solves the geometry problem. It explains where the ramp material went. It never had to be removed because it was the pyramid. And it accounts for certain anomalies that have shown up in non-invasive scans of the pyramid's interior, regions of slightly different density that could be consistent with a filled or partially open passage. The hypothesis has not been confirmed. Confirming it without invasive investigation would require imaging technology of a precision that is still being developed, and the pyramid has not been opened for exploratory excavation. The idea sits in the space between compelling and proven, which is where much of the pyramid's story lives. What emerges from all of this, taken together, is a picture in which the answer is probably not any single method, but several working in sequence. The lowest courses, the largest blocks, the ones that required the most raw hauling force, were raised by one set of approaches, and as the pyramid grew narrower and the blocks became somewhat smaller, the method shifted to fit the new geometry of the work. The workforce was organized well enough to adapt, to build what was needed when it was needed, and dismantle it when the work moved on. The ramp, whatever its final form, was not permanent. It was a tool, and tools were removed when the job was done. The upper portions of the pyramid, the ones that would have been most difficult to reach, are also the ones where the evidence is thinnest, where the geometry of any proposed solution becomes most strained, and where the imagination of researchers has had the most room to move. That thinness of evidence is not a failure of archaeology so much as a reflection of how completely the builders cleaned up after themselves, how thoroughly temporary infrastructure was dismantled and scattered. The pyramid stands in the landscape with almost no trace of the scaffolding of thought and effort and organization that assembled it, and that absence is its own kind of remarkable fact. Somewhere in the accumulated centuries of sand and wind and the slow degradation of materials that were never meant to last, the ramps and the sledge paths and the working surfaces of the plateau dissolved back into the landscape while the stone itself remained. What the builders left in the end was not a record of the process, but the result of it, rising at its angle against the sky, indifferent to the question of how it got there. And yet the process did leave traces, in places no one thought to look for a very long time. A few hundred meters south of the pyramid, beneath layers of sand that accumulated over 4,500 years, archaeologists working in the 1990s uncovered something that had not been anticipated: an entire settlement, purpose-built and organized, that had housed the people who built the Great Pyramid. Not a camp in the rough sense, not a temporary arrangement of shelters thrown up against the desert wind, but a planned community with bakeries and breweries, with storage facilities and administrative buildings, with sleeping quarters organized into what appear to have been units corresponding to different gangs or teams of workers. The settlement covered a substantial area of the plateau's southern edge, and what came out of it rewrote, quietly and permanently, the story of who actually raised the stones. The workers were not slaves. That is the finding, and it is worth letting it settle for a moment before moving on. The old image, enormous coerced crowds whipped across the sand under the supervision of overseers, belongs entirely to a later era of storytelling, not to the archaeology of Giza. The people who built the Great Pyramid were organized laborers, fed and housed by the state, working within an administrative structure that tracked their numbers, their rations, their rotations, and their health. They were organized into large divisions with names, and those divisions were subdivided into smaller gangs, and those gangs into crews of perhaps 20 men each. And those men are in the record because the record was kept carefully by people whose job it was to keep it. The bakeries found at the settlement were industrial in scale, capable of producing enormous quantities of bread each day. Beef and fish bones recovered from the site point to a diet that was, by the standards of the ancient world, reasonably substantial. Protein, grain, beer, which served as both nutrition and hydration in a climate where water alone was not always reliable. The workers were being provisioned, which meant they were being valued, at least instrumentally, as bodies that needed to remain functional. Whether that provisioning felt generous or bare from the inside of a working life at Giza is not something the archaeology can say. But the material evidence points to an organized logistical effort to sustain a large workforce over a long period of construction. Medical care left its own traces. Among the skeletal remains recovered from worker cemeteries near the settlement, there is evidence of healed injuries, fractures that were set and recovered, amputations that the individual survived long enough to show bone regrowth around the site of the wound. The pyramid was a dangerous place to work, and some of the people who worked there were injured in ways that required intervention, and some of those interventions appear to have succeeded well enough that the person lived for years afterward. That is not the picture of a workforce considered disposable. The cemeteries themselves are telling. The workers buried near the plateau were buried with some care, in tombs that, while modest compared to the grand mastabas of the elite, were proper tombs, marked and intended to be permanent. Some of the supervisors and higher-ranking workers were buried in more elaborate structures nearby, with inscriptions that gave their names and their titles. The names are ordinary names, not royal names, not priestly names. They are the names of working people, and they are in the ground near the thing they spent their lives building. In 2013, a further layer of the record emerged when a collection of papyrus documents was studied in detail, among the oldest papyri ever found in Egypt, and extraordinary in their specificity. One set, written by an official named Mera, records in careful administrative language the daily movements of his team as they transported limestone from the quarries at Tura across the water to the Giza plateau. The entries are almost mundane in tone, the kind of record a logistics manager might keep: which day the boats departed, what they carried, where they stopped. But the mundanity is the point. The construction of the Great Pyramid appears in these documents, not as a mythological event, but as a managed operation, with timetables and supply chains, and a man named Mera, who wrote things down at the end of each working day, so that someone further up the administrative structure would know what had been accomplished. His entries mention the harbor near the pyramid, the transfer of stones from boat to shore, the coordination between his team and others working elsewhere on the plateau. The scale of the logistical operation implied by even this single administrator's records is considerable. Mera was one supervisor among many, managing one team among many, and his papyrus covers only a portion of one phase of the construction. What the full administrative record would have looked like if it had survived is not something that can be known. But the fragment that does survive suggests a degree of organizational complexity that the bare stone of the pyramid itself does not obviously advertise. There is something quietly affecting about this accumulation of detail. The bread rations and the healed fractures, and the man who wrote down where his boats went. The pyramid tends to be encountered as an abstraction, a number too large to hold, a mass of stone that defies ordinary comprehension. But the settlement and the cemeteries and the papyri return it to something more graspable, a project that unfolded over the course of many years, inside the working lives of many thousands of ordinary people who woke each morning in their quarters south of the plateau, ate their bread, and went to move stone. Some of them were permanent workers, skilled craftsmen and administrators who lived at the site for years. Others appear to have come in rotating shifts, perhaps from towns and villages throughout Egypt, serving a term of labor as part of a broader system of organized obligation to the state. The two groups seem to have been distinguished in the administrative records, with the permanent core and the rotating laborers tracked separately, their rations and their housing arrangements reflecting their different relationships to the project. What those people made of the thing they were building is not recorded. The papyri are administrative, not reflective. The tomb inscriptions of the supervisors give titles and names, but not inner lives. What remains is the external record: the bread consumed, the bones healed, the stone moved, the daily entries in a careful hand on sheets of papyrus that somehow survived 4,500 years of time. The pyramid was built by people who had names and injuries, and supervisors, and a daily ration of fish. That is a different kind of fact than the number of blocks, and it sits differently in the mind, quieter somehow, and more durable. And then there is the pyramid itself, still standing in the place where it was built, on the plateau at the edge of what is now the city of Cairo, surrounded by the same desert it has always faced. The stone has weathered. The outer surface, once that smooth and brilliant white, now shows the rougher core beneath, the local limestone in its natural color, warm and grey-brown in morning light, darker when the sun is low. The shape is unmistakable from any direction, from a great distance, rising above everything around it in a way that does not change with the angle of approach. It is simply there, in the way that very old things are simply there, with a quality of presence that newer structures rarely carry. It was finished somewhere around 4,500 years ago. Everything that has been said over the course of this night about its construction, the local limestone cut from nearby quarries, the white casing shipped from across the river, the granite brought hundreds of miles from the south, the sledges running on wet sand, the ramps that rose in whatever configuration they rose in, the tens of thousands of people organized into gangs with names and rations and supervisors. All of that effort produced this. All of that effort produced this. A structure that has outlasted the civilization that made it by more than 3,000 years. No iron tools were used in its construction. The copper chisels and stone hammers that shaped the blocks were adequate to the task, which says something about the adequacy of time and organization when they are applied with enough patience. There were no wheels in the sense that they are used now. No wheeled carts rolling loaded blocks across the ground. The sledge, pulled by ropes and eased across surfaces made slick with water, was the primary vehicle. There were no horses, no oxen pulling loads. Human bodies and human ropes and human coordination carried every block from wherever it began to wherever it came to rest. The pyramid contains roughly 2.5 million blocks of stone. Some of the lightest weigh around 2.5 tons. The granite beams above the king's chamber, deep in the interior, weigh somewhere between 50 and 80 tons each. They are still there, still in place, still holding. The chamber they roof has not collapsed. The ceiling has not shifted. The geometry of the structure distributes its immense weight around the internal spaces in a way that has proven, over millennia, to be correct. The precision with which the base was laid, leveled to within a few centimeters across an area the size of several city blocks, was achieved using water, string, and careful observation. The alignment to the cardinal directions, north and south and east and west, is accurate to within a small fraction of a degree. These things were accomplished without the measuring instruments that would now be assumed necessary for work of this kind. They were accomplished by people using the tools they had, and they were accomplished well enough to still be demonstrable 4,000 years later with modern survey equipment. What exactly happened inside the pyramid ritually and architecturally in the years after it was sealed, is only partially recovered. The burial chambers were entered and stripped long before any systematic documentation took place. What the builders intended, room by room and passage by passage, lives now in the structure itself. In the angles of the shafts, the dimensions of the corridors, the placement of the portcullises, the choice to build the king's chamber of granite when limestone would have been so much easier to source and move. The decisions are legible. The reasoning behind them is not always clear. That openness is not a failure of the record. It is simply what the distance of 4,500 years produces. There are things that are known, and there are things that remain, for now, genuinely open. The two categories sit alongside each other without difficulty. The way the pyramid itself sits alongside the city that has grown up around it, neither explaining the other, both simply present. The desert around the plateau is quiet at night. The city light diffuses upward and outward, and the pyramid stands in it, catching the ambient glow on its stone faces. It does not move. It does not change at any pace that a human lifetime could measure. The sand around its base shifts slightly in wind. The temperature drops after dark. Nothing else happens at any speed worth noting. There is something in the sheer duration of its standing that resists ordinary description. It was old before the Roman Empire existed. It was already ancient when the libraries of the classical world were founded. The people who first encountered it as a historical artifact rather than a living monument had already lost most of the knowledge of how it was made. And still the knowledge is being recovered, slowly, from papyri found in caves, from tool marks in quarry walls, from the stains of ancient pathways across the sand, from the careful analysis of what remains. The pyramid does not require anything from the people who look at it now. It asked for something extraordinary from the people who built it, and they provided it, and then time closed over that exchange and left only the stone. What is still not fully known is held quietly in that stone, in the spacing of the blocks, in the engineering of the passages, in the particular weight of silence that collects in the internal chambers in the dark, where no wind reaches and the granite walls are cool to the touch, and overhead, without ceremony, the ceiling holds.